Hello, BookTube. As many of you will know, and as all of you should know, I am an esteemed GigaChad life coach, a motivational god, as it were. And as a result, since I leave my email on every video, I often get questions from random losers out there in the world who have some subject on their mind that they want me to expound upon. And I have decided to read some of these letters in a segment that will be ongoing on this channel called Dear King Tentacle. And I have one here that I want to read to you, and we'll discuss it just a bit. The plaintiff here, the seeker after knowledge, says, "Most esteemed cephalopod, what is a novel in verse? Why not just call it poetry? What was so novel about Eugene Onegin? Shifting perspective, chapter structure, the Onegin stanza. Didn't preceding poetry already have some of these features? And does a verse novel even need the Onegin stanza? If not, what specific characteristics make a verse novel? Lastly, I'm wondering when the descriptive classification arose. Wouldn't 19th century readers have understood themselves to be reading a verse novel or merely a narrative poem? Thanks." And this is a very good question. We don't have to spend too long on it, but the key is not art, it's marketing. There is no difference between a novel in verse and a narrative poem. There is no difference between that other than length. And narrative poems can get pretty long. Now, the key here is marketing. Because in the middle of the 20th century, a school of poetry came along that abandoned craft, experience, literary illusions, narrative storytelling, scansion of any kind, and instead indulged in mystique. And that stays true to today, and has given rise to a whole generation of poets, in fact, 2 generations of poets, where the whole thing shifted from, this is just a kind of writing, and you can either be good or bad at it, and everyone will be able to tell whether you're good or bad at it because of the end result. No one will be in any doubt, because this is just a kind of writing. And because no one will, at the same time that no one will be in any doubt whether or not the end result is any good, no one will be in any doubt whether or not the end result is really good, and they'll really like it. You'll be able to make a living as a poet, and no one will think anything of it. Everybody in all walks of life will say, well, yeah, I read all sorts of things, including poetry. Of course I do. Up until the mid-20th century in America, readers thought that way. In fact, if anything, they thought going in the other direction. If anything, the majority of readers thought, well, the most of the thing that I read is poetry, because it's just so darn good. Then in the middle of the 20th century, arose a school of poetry that was intensely solipsistic. It was ironclad, so that not only was it all about the poet, but it offered no extenuating circumstances to any stranger. It didn't offer any explanations of anything that it was saying, because it was trading in mystique. The poem, all of a sudden, doesn't have to make any sense. All you have to do is act like you're in the know. So the poet can get up on the stage at the Cantab Lounge in a black turtleneck and black slacks and a black beret and start intoning their poetry. They start intoning it. Woody Woodpecker left me on Grand Street. Reservoir. Reservoir. Bluebird Reservoir. That's halfway through the poem. At that point, the poet gets a phone call on their cell phone. They take the call and just stand there talking. The call is not staged. The caller is not part of the performance. They just stand there talking in an act of open, pee-on-the-face hatred of the audience. And what does the audience do? Instead of getting out, instead of all turning around and leaving, they stand there thinking, well, it's all important that I be in the know. This is thrilling. Oh, they titter amongst themselves. Oh, this is the best performance I've ever gone to. I don't understand anything about what's going on, and this is an obvious insult, but no. The thing is, if you don't understand it, that means it's real poetry. Oh, how exquisite. Then the poet finishes up by telling the friend on the other end of the phone, yeah, I've got these a-holes in the crowd. I got to finish reading this poem to them. They can all hear it. The poet hangs up, puts the phone back, looks up with extremely exaggerated nonchalance, and continues with what they're calling a poem. Pogo stick, not that year. Uncle Raymond. If you know the poet, and if you've known the poet their whole life, You will understand some of those allusions, but they literally make no sense at all if you don't. Not at all. They don't make any sense internally in the poem. They aren't connected to each other. They certainly aren't beautifully written. They don't make any sense at all to an audience who doesn't personally know the poet and who hasn't personally known the poet for a long time. Those people get it. Everyone else is acting like they get it because whoever was marketing all of this managed to succeed in pulling the wool over the reading public's eyes. I maintain that that didn't actually happen because it was right around that time that poetry lost 95% of its audience and became the extremely niche, unbelievably unbearable subgenre that it is today. No one buys a new volume of poetry, except the very worst people, the people that buy their purchase you know to avoid. No one goes to poetry readings except the most pretentious people anywhere in the literary world, and that's saying something. No one does this. It has been reduced to the most prissy and irrelevant literary ghetto in the history of prissy and irrelevant literary ghettos, specifically because it did that. Because it turned to the audience and said, anything that I do is poetry. And you don't have to understand it anymore. In fact, you'd better lap it up without understanding it. This is not the charge of the Light Brigade. I'm not going to tell you a story, okay? Said with disdain, as if somehow, somewhere along the way, some president of the intellectual world, as if there were one, decided that stories were bad and that comprehensible poetry was amateur. Greeting card type of stuff. And the whole poetry world, almost the whole poetry world went along with that, to its destruction. Now, ordinary people who have a very vibrant, thriving reading habit would no more think about buying a new poetry collection than they would think about going to the latest, spoken word shout and throw feces at the audience poetry event, a slam poetry contest. They wouldn't do it. And when you do go to those events, you are surrounded by people who think that poetry is an attitude rather than an art. And one of the casualties of that change that happened in the middle of the 20th century, and is still true, poetry has not come back. I don't think anyone would want it back. It would have to build an audience from scratch. And I don't think that's possible. I think it killed itself. But the main casualty from that is a poem that is trying to be beautiful and tell you something, and tell you a comprehensible story that you don't need to know the author to understand. So that's when the terminology started really cropping up and becoming popular, a novel in verse. Because that normal reading public, the 95% that poetry scorned and sent out into the fields, understands what a novel is. They don't understand poetry anymore. What is called poetry is not. It's not pretty. It's not thought-provoking. It's not literarily excellent. It's not comprehensible in any way. It's not anything poetry ever was for 3,000 years. It's not anything like that. So they don't know what... If you call something poetry now, all of their instincts go off. They know to avoid it. But a novel they understand. There are plenty of novels that readers love. Even I love plenty of novels. So if you want to get around that horrible decision on the part of poetry to immolate itself on the pyre of cool and laziness, keep in mind, it isn't just trying to be cool, it's authors being lazy. I could do the traditional route and learn poetry and work hard at it and read all my betters and craft my prose, but I'd rather not. I'd rather just crap out random thoughts and call it poetry. And dare you not to. If a few exceptions in that new world of poetry want a poetry volume to actually sell well, a lot of times, especially if they want to tell a long, complicated story, they have to call it a novel in verse. If they just call it a poem, there's a huge swath of the reading public who's been conditioned in the last 80 years to avoid it like the plague. They will. They absolutely will. You will get long poems. One of the most famous ones that is usually brought up in this discussion is by Vikram Seth, Golden Gate. It is very good. It's very enjoyable. A lot of times, unfortunately, a thing that is marketed as a novel in verse will also feel like a novel that's just stacked vertically, which is not a narrative poem. That is, a narrative poem does things that a novel in verse can't do. Would be embarrassed to try. You will occasionally get long poems that just, defy that. Omeros by Derek Walcott is fantastic, but not often. You won't often get them that way. Also, one of my favorites that I love, although nobody knows it anymore, nobody reads it anymore, it hasn't been in print in forever, I think, is Jason Medea by John Gardner. which is a story about Jason and the Argonauts and Jason and Medea, told in verse. And there are other examples like that, but they are rare. They are very rare. And I don't imagine them getting any more popular, because the change that poetry took with the beats killed it as a popular genre. Popular in both senses of the word. In other words, popular in that lots of people know about it and like it, and it sells well, and it makes the author a well-known public figure, and also popular in the sense of that anyone can enjoy it. It doesn't have to be part of this extremely elite group of a-holes that like to condescend to people. Oh, I suppose that's poetry. I mean, it rhymes. You probably like that, right? I am never closer to inchoate rage than when I'm in conversation and I hear something like that, which is why I don't tend to enter conversations anymore with humans. I mostly stick to conversations that can't go wrong about poop. but that, my dear supplicant, is the answer to your question, to your dear King Tentacle question. The difference here is not one of art, it's one of marketing. And this weird marketing that happened to poetry in my lifetime that took it out of the realm of active genres and made it into whatever it is today, where it is incomprehensible. It comes from now a long tradition of incomprehensibility, and its authors are proud of how incomprehensible it is. So I know that answer isn't consoling to you, but you do have, the consoling part is that you do have lots and lots of great narrative poems from ages past that you can read and enjoy. They aren't going anywhere. So you can go and enjoy those. And if I come across a narrative poem or a novel in verse sometime this year that is good, I will be sure to let you know. But anyway, that's the latest installment of Dear King Tentacle. Feel free to send in your questions, and I will get to them in my own time. Thank you, BookTube.